Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Judaism Demystified, Rabbi Wolpe. In these times, intra-faith dialogue is as critical as interfaith dialogue, especially after October 7th. The Jewish people must come together to understand and support one another, breaking down walls that divide our communities. This conversation aims to foster mutual understanding and unity among Jews of diverse perspectives. So I want to thank you for coming on. And for the first question, you've often spoken of Maimonides as the most important Jewish thinker to you. His teachings deeply resonate within Orthodox Judaism, yet his philosophy also holds universal Jewish appeal. How do you see Maimonides' ideas influencing not only your personal approach, but also for the broader Jewish world in the modern age?
So it's a large question to begin with, because Maimonides is also probably the most complex figure in the history of Jewish thought, although he has some rivals. But I would say that the legacy of Maimonides is separate but complementary. That is, there's the Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah and the Maimonides of the Moreh Nevuchim. And the Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah is somebody who was trying as best he could to make the law as simple as possible for the man in the street. So it's written in simple Mishnaic Hebrew. He doesn't give sources because he doesn't think that the average person is going to go delve into all the sources. He arbitrates very complicated Talmudic disputes, but you don't know it when you're reading it because he's just saying, do this, don't do that. And that Maimonides is a communal leader who tries to help people, who tries to make Judaism as accessible as possible. And that, if that were Maimonides alone, Dayenu, I mean, that's already an amazing achievement, obviously, in addition to everything else that he did that we know about his communal work and about his being the physician to the Sultan, and the famous letter that he wrote to Ibn Tibbon about, you can come visit me if you want, but this is my schedule. And his schedule puts us all to shame. And in the meantime, he was also writing the Mishnah Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim. But I think the Maimonides that we're referring to in this conversation much more is the Maimonides of the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. And that Rambam, that Maimonides, is someone who is open to the wisdom of the world in an attempt to show the ways in which that wisdom is channeled through the Jewish tradition. So he says that you should accept the truth from wherever it comes, but his assumption is that the deep truths of the world are all found in the Torah. And I say the deep truths because it doesn't mean it might be that the Torah doesn't tell you that this medicine is the right thing to take for this ailment, but the deep truths of life are found in the Torah. And so the dual fidelity that the Rambam has to intellectual openness and also Jewish normativity is remarkable and inspiring. And when you see the different kinds of scholars, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, I mean, in our day, Chacham Faur and Isidore Tversky write very different books about Rambam, but both of them grapple with both sides of this protean figure. And I don't think that it is possible really to take Judaism seriously without at least dipping your toe in the sea of the Rambam.
Very well said. That definitely resonates with us. And what I want to know is, this modern generation, we're dealing with a lot of new challenges, and one of them obviously is atheism, skepticism. So I feel like the Rambam is just a very useful kind of weapon, to kind of fight back. I feel the same way.
Also because the Rambam insists that Judaism is consonant with reason. And and that you don't, at the core of Christianity is a belief that is deliberately non-rational, that three and one is three, and so on. There's nothing essentially non-rational that a Jew has to believe in order to be a Jew, right? I mean, miracles we could have a long discussion about, but even that is not the core belief,
Right.
right? The core belief is, Mamad Har Sinai, and there's nothing irrational. You might say it did happen, it didn't happen, it happened this way, it happened that way, but there's nothing about it that demands you put your reason aside in order to believe it. And that, I think, is a great advantage as a tradition.
Absolutely. So this brings me to the next question, which is the evolution of new atheism. So in recent years, new atheism seems to have evolved with figures like Christopher Hitchens giving way to voices like Alex O'Connor.
Mhm.
How do you perceive this shift, and what impact do you think it has on dialogues about faith, especially within a Jewish context?
One of the things that I think is true is that new atheism is not quite as biting and angry. Um, and I find that interesting. And I think actually that a lot of the anger that drove the old new atheism, if you will, came from 9/11, came from the recognition that there was a faith out there that was destructive of so much of what was Western civilization. That's jihadism, the jihadist branch of Islam, that was intent on being anti-Western, anti-Israel, anti-America, and so there was this tremendous pushback because that's where Sam Harris wrote his books in the wake of 9/11, so did Christopher Hitchens, and so on. Now, I think the question is much more is this true or not, and is it good for society, as opposed to we are fighting this great civilizational battle against faith. Um, and 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 part of the problem that the new atheism has also, which I don't think the old new atheism took on quite as much, is that materialist science is just much more complicated than people used to think it was. And quantum physics is really not straight materialism. And once you start to get into the higher reaches of speculation about the world, all of a sudden, everything solid melts into air, to use an old phrase. And we recognize that the world is much more complicated and much deeper. And as the great biologist J.B.S. Haldane said, the world is not only queerer than we imagine, it's queerer than we can imagine. So once you open up that box and you say, oh my God, I actually can't figure this all out, I think that there's a possibility of faith that's much harder to just slam shut than seemed to be in the days of Christopher Hitchens or his more illustrious predecessors like Bertrand Russell.
Absolutely. David Chai, you have anything you wanted to follow up with that as well?
Yeah, I think those are such great points about like the new atheism being a bit less biting than the old new atheism. I
Mhm.
remember that much of like the Four Horsemen's sort of, talking points were about how religion is what drives
Right.
this kind of like really dangerous ideologies. And now it's becoming a more respectable position. I think that the world, as it opens up and as we see more and more complexity, it's becoming a more respectable position to hold. And that brings me to my sort of the next question, I suppose, is that nowadays you sort of branch off of the new atheist figures and you get people who are more, they speak in religious terms, but they're not really religious. They're more like culturally religious, I think is the term. So you have people like Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson. They champion a lot of values which are rooted in religious traditions, and they don't necessarily embrace full religious observance. What do you think of that approach? Can somebody meaningfully uphold a religious message without the religious commitments that typically come with it, or is the religious commitment part and parcel of the message?
So it's a great question. And I want to know, when you say religious commitment, Dennis and Jordan are different, right? Because one is Jewish and one is not. So the Jewish tradition is somewhat different from Christianity, and I don't want to speak for Christianity, obviously, for lots of reasons. But I would say this is like my go-to answer about that question for Jewish groups, which is the problem with maintaining Judaism in the absence of specific ritual behavior is that there's nothing uniquely Jewish about being a good person. There's nothing uniquely Jewish about being ethical. There's nothing uniquely Jewish about being kind. Notice I say uniquely. It is Jewish to be kind. It is Jewish to be good. It is Jewish to be ethical, all those things. But you can do all those things and not be Jewish. It is uniquely Jewish to light Shabbos candles. It's uniquely Jewish to keep kosher. So if you want to maintain Judaism as a tradition, I think you have to have behaviors that distinguish it from other ways of being a good person in the world. I don't want to speak for Dennis particularly. I don't know what his level of observance is or he's not now. But I do believe that you need a uniquely Jewish pattern of behavior in order to sustain a Jewish life. And without it, it just dissolves into I'm a good person.
Well said.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying there. I suppose I should have differentiated between Dennis Prager and Jordan
Right.
Peterson. I guess so. What is your take on people like Jordan Peterson's message, right? Like, is there they seem to specifically extrapolate the lessons of the Bible and very, very forcefully in some ways, and very deeply in ways that you may not hear from a religious person. So what do you
So
make of
I reviewed Peterson's second book. I have not reviewed his book yet on the Bible. I mean, I might at some point. I don't know. I haven't read it. But here is my impression of Peterson, and I'm perfectly willing to be wrong because, as I say, I haven't read his book on the Bible, although I've heard him speak about it. My impression is that he does not want to be pinned down to specific Jewish convictions. He doesn't want to say this is true, this is not true, in the sense in which we most usually understand truth to be a correspondence with reality. But he does want the authority of the religious text to be full. And that's a hard match to make. I get the authority, but I don't necessarily affirm fully its veracity. And so it's not that that's never done. I mean, the rabbis often cast doubt on this or that or the other thing and still or created midrashim and saying we should learn from this. But it's a really hard match to make, and I understand why for some people that wouldn't work. So
fascinating. I see what you're saying, and I think that I mean I followed your work and New Atheist and Jordan Peterson for a while, and I think that's a very valid assessment. And one of the things he says, and this will blend into the next question, is he says that there is a brilliance in the story, and he loves this story of Cain and Abel. He
right.
says in 10 verses, the writer of Cain and Abel did what no other author could ever do, and that authority that he wants that you're speaking about is present in that sentence. So with that in mind, there seems to be this desire for the authority of morality, for the authority of all these philosophical questions to be rooted in biblical claims of some sort.
Yes.
Yeah, I know you just mentioned that it's not a unique thing to be Jewish, to be a good person. It's not unique to be a good person to Judaism.
Right.
Jews are good, but that's not what you need to be a good person. So there's a lot of sort of pushback on the Bible being the force of morality. There's a lot of questions about morality and the Bible's words and teachings. So we just want to go over some of these problems and questions with you. So like for many of people, the problem of evil and their other challenges of faith are significant barriers to belief. So how would you respond to these following points about philosophical problems? of evil. So one is gratuitous evil. Why would a loving God allow seemingly senseless suffering, right? And there's obviously natural suffering for which there is no human cause of sin in some sort that we can see. There's gratuitous suffering is a whole category of its own. Another question that often comes up is the geography that determines very heavily whether you would be a believer, right? We can tell statistically if based on where you're born, how likely you are to believe in God or a certain variation of religion, with very precise metrics. And the final question, and I think this is a little bit newer, and I've only recently become familiar with this one. This is called the non-resistant non-belief problem. So the idea is that a loving God would want to have a relationship with all who seek him, and there would be no such concept of a loving God who is not available to those who seek him out earnestly. So, with these three problems, and there are plenty more,
Right.
how can we address this problem and how can the Bible sort of maybe help us along those lines?
So that's a really good array. My answer to the first one of gratuitous suffering is that if good and evil, that is, I'm talking about good and evil in terms of suffering, pain, bliss, happiness. If they were not randomly distributed in the world, there would be no possibility of human goodness. That is, if good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, everyone would be good, but the reason they would be good is so that they would get rewarded. The only possibility of being good is to be good without knowing whether you'll be rewarded or not. So randomness is an essential part of goodness, I think, and that's a really hard system. And I know when someone is suffering, you don't say that, right? But if you ask me in a detached manner, that's the best explanation I know for why it is that the world is unfair, which I believe it is. As to the second question of, like, if I were born in New Delhi, I'd be a Hindu, which I suspect is true. My feeling is that there are many, many avenues to God, and that religions are not so much propositionally correct as they are directionally correct. That is, if a tradition allows you to connect with that which is greater than yourself, whether you call it God or something else, that's what is needed in this world. And this is reinforced. This is a much easier argument for a Jew to make, I think, than other religions, because we're not a proselytizing religion. We never felt like to have a relationship with God, you had to be Jewish. I mean, it's clear in the Bible, right? Melchizedek has a relationship with the one God. He's not Jewish. And from the very beginning, we always said, like, you can be anything. And if you have a relationship with God, you have a relationship with God. The third question reminds me of what Arthur Cohen, who was a theologian, once said about Abraham Joshua Heschel. He said, he has no feeling for the tragedy of unbelief. In other words, the person who wants to believe but can't get there. And I do think that there is a sense in which faith is a talent like music or art that some people are just really good at. I know people who have never had a doubt about God in their entire lives. They just never have. And I think of them as sort of like Mozart's bitachon. They're like, they just believe, and they've always believed, and they always will believe, and that's it, and there's nothing more to discuss. I am not myself that way, and most people are not that way. But I have no problem saying to the person who finds it hard to believe that actually, for a lot of people, belief takes work. And so, I mean, the old story about the guy who asked the rabbi, why should I put on tefillin? And he said, well, you have to put on tefillin for a year for me to answer that question. There is something in engaging in the community and the tradition and so on that helps people, I think, answer that question. But I want to add one caveat, which is, it's true that at the center of religion is one's relationship with God. But it is also true that so much of what you feel about your tradition has to do with what human beings introduce it to you and how they introduce it to you. So I know people, I've had people, I know this is not going to shock you. I cannot count the number of people who have said to me things like, when I was 12, the rabbi yelled at me, so I don't believe anymore. And I want to say to them, first of all, that the rabbi is not Judaism. Second of all, the rabbi's allowed to have a bad day, or there are bad rabbis, like they're bad everything else.
Right.
Or maybe the rabbi's not good with kids, or God knows what else. But people's experience of religion is sometimes so tied to human figures, parents, rabbis, priests, ministers, that sometimes we have to get them to overcome their initial rejection and rediscover something that they think has nothing for them.
We just recently had an episode with Rabbi David Aaron, and we were discussing the phenomenon of off the derech,
Right.
which is, from his experience, and I feel the same way, that a lot of people who leave the path, it's often because of something experiential rather than something feels.
Absolutely.
It's not like, oh, I can't grasp this idea of God. That's often used as an excuse, maybe, but really they went through something, some type of trauma.
Look, I had my Uber driver, Shmuel, my Uber driver, says to me, when I came to America, I had nothing. And I went with my relatives to shul. And I always went to shul. I went to shul every day. I went with my relatives to shul. And the rabbi saw I was new, and he gave me an aliyah, and then he asked me for a donation. And I said, if that's what this is about, I'm done. And I've not stepped into a shul since. And we spent the whole Uber ride with my saying to him, like, Shmuel, it's like, that's not right. But it's amazing how often that happens. And that means that people who are religious have to redouble their efforts to be decent and welcoming, because it's amazing how much power you have to turn people off, and the opposite, and to bring them closer, to do kiru.
I just wanted to add to what you said before, actually,
Right.
speaking of the Rambam, but he talks about Christianity and Islam as being, maybe not the truth, but it's a positive development for mankind
Right.
for when that we reach the messianic age.
Right.
There will be an understanding of God because of all this. But also, I think that as an Orthodox Jew and you being a conservative Jew, what I look at, sometimes, unfortunately, what could happen with Orthodoxy is that it becomes too kind of obsessed, and it's not a slight in any way, but what happens is people sometimes lose the big picture when I call it pots and pans Judaism, where it's which is obviously these things are, but
it's important, right? I know
it's important, but like
it's easy to get lost. Look, it's what Heschel used to call religious behaviorism, and I would say Judaism is a great tradition for people who have a touch of OCD.
Yeah.
But if you have too much OCD, you tend to get lost only in the stuff, and you forget that actually what's behind it is what's,
Right. So the trade-off is, I was going to mention that in the conservative world, let's say you guys champion more like midot and Navi, you study
but
that.
as a result,
Right. So the thing is, there's also less focus on let's say and then just statistically, you see a drop off in
no question.
observance. So
well, also I will say this though about the drop off of an observance, which I think is important to recognize, is when people say to me, why is Orthodoxy doing so well in the world right now, as opposed to the non-Orthodox denominations? I mean, first of all credit to Orthodoxy. They've done many, many wonderful things, and they've done a lot of things right, and they have great rabbis and great educational institutions, and I don't mean to slight that at all. But it is also true that the more traditional forms of religion are working in every religion right now. There are more fundamentalist Christians, more Muslims, more Hindus, and the left in every religious tradition is suffering. This is like a vast worldwide sociological phenomenon. Maybe it will stay, maybe it will change. I don't know. We'll see. Only time will tell.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and
Yeah.
it's not a by any means. I'm not, it's not a criticism. I'm just observing, and
No, that's good.
I think what can come hopefully come out of these kind of these conversations are is that we can take the best of both worlds, where we focus on because a lot of times you like it bothers me where I see people like aren't focused on midot, how we
Right.
treat others, and we get lost in these little details. But we're also, for example, like we move more towards Talmud study versus studying the fundamentals, the Tanakh, and we're missing out on it. That's a topic that comes up a lot in our podcast. So I think that part of this conversation is to bridge that gap where we could see that we're all Jews, we all care about each other, and it's important to have these conversations because ultimately we're in this together.
Well, so that's my like if you say to me, what's my bottom line? And I'm not saying this should be everyone's bottom line. I'm just telling you it's mine. My bottom line is Ahavat Yisrael. If you care about other Jews, we're good. I mean, there are a lot of other things I want you to care about, but it's the people who don't really have that concern for the Jewish people. And so I always tell people, for example, when Ruth converts in the Bible, what does she say first? First, she says, your people will be my people. And then she says, and your God will be my God. Because in some ways, the Jewish people have tremendous priority in the Jewish tradition. And you have to have that real sense of love for the Jewish people. And if you have that, I think that will keep you somehow in the fold in one way or another. And we know through generations things change. But if you have that, that's really crucial.
Yeah, and we're kind of just forced to have this conversation because of
Right.
the aftermath of October
Yeah.
7th.
Exactly.
And I think that, we're so many people like we're in the age of information. So amazingly, we can have these conversations on Zoom, but I think that like being on Instagram, I've noticed that a lot of the people who've stepped up to the plate and unified us and try to fight
Right.
for the Jewish people
Yeah.
are actually just like moms and regular
Yes.
people. Not, let's say, like
Right.
I always said, like I feel like there's an emptiness without Rabbi Sachs.
Yes.
I felt like he would have been perfect for this, addressing this kind of
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
He's the kind of leader we're missing, but like I'm loving what I see in terms of like these grassroots kind of, people on the ground speaking up and connecting to their Judaism. And even in Israel, I have a lot of family in Israel, like some less religious, some more, but everyone's questioning, who am I? What is my where's my place in the world right now?
So this is why it sounds strange. I love the book of Vayikra because even though I grant you that it's the most boring book of the Torah, if you're allowed to say that, but here's the thing that I get from Vayikra more than anything else. It's all full of what the priests are supposed to do, the Kohanim are supposed to do. And when I almost every time when I talk about it, I tell people, you see, there's no secret knowledge here. It's not like the priests know something that nobody else is allowed to know. It's like any Jew can change the world. Any Jew can speak out exactly what you're saying. It's like this mother who yesterday was, nobody says, well, how much you know of Masechet Beitza? If you don't know that, then we're not going to listen to you. No. You can, any Jew, since all of the tradition is open to you and all of the drashot are open, any Jew can say. I know in theory that's not true of Kabbalah, although the truth is that rule about 40 was violated much more often than it was observed. But that's the wonderful thing about the Jewish tradition is really we learn from the great sages and scholars, but the Pintele Yid, as the tradition has it, like the simple Jew, can have a tremendous voice in our community.
Yeah, and I think that, we see Chabad, they have a lot of success because they do
Yes.
reach out to other people.
Yeah.
And I want to see that. There's all this fear about like, we have to put up these walls and there are Reform Jews, there's conservative Jews, and we're all like they're around us everywhere. And we have
Yeah.
to, especially now, we have to have conversations. I alluded to this in the beginning. It's so important, but I actually wanted to ask your opinion on what's happening to Judaism in America. We talked about October 7th, but
Yeah.
now the Jews in America have an identity crisis in a way because they're also being bombarded with all this negativity on, social media, on college campuses, like everywhere they go, people are hiding, maybe feeling they have to hide
Right.
their Judaism. What do you feel is the end game here, and what can we do about this?
So I think there are three big challenges to Jews in America. One is anti-Semitism, right and left. They're different, and they have different causes and different manifestations. And like what I saw at Harvard was clearly from the left. But we always have to monitor wherever it rears its head. We can never afford to play the politics game of I only care about it on the right or I only care about it on the left. That's one. The second is what we're talking about here, ignorance and assimilation and just not caring about the tradition and learning. And then the third is we have to combat the Jewish sense that we're alone. And I say that because there are a lot of people of goodwill in America who care about us, a lot. And first of all, we're much, much better at identifying our enemies than we are at embracing our friends. But second, these friends, like, it's insulting to them when they hear Jews say, we're alone, nobody cares about us. And it's a big challenge to get Jews to recognize that you don't have to agree with everything that your friends say. You can have lots of political disagreements, but if somebody respects the Jewish people and wants the best for the state of Israel, you're my friend, And so right, left, center, whatever part you are on the political spectrum, I can fight with you about other things. But that's also really important. So we have a three-pronged battle against anti-Semitism, against ignorance, and against a perceived isolation. Having said that, let me just tell you something very encouraging that Eli Wiesel, alav shalom, said to me when he came to our shul to be the scholar in residence for the 100th anniversary of the shul. So I was complaining about all these things. That's what you do. And he said to me, listen, David, when I was liberated from the camps, we had three impossible missions. One was to have a state of Israel. The second was to free Soviet Jewry. And the third was to revitalize Jewish life throughout the world. He said, we did 1 and 2. You have no right to despair of doing 3. And I thought, wow, we tend to forget about our triumphs and we only focus on the things we haven't done well. But I always think about that because the truth is we've lived in an age of miracles. So there could be more.
So speaking of things we haven't done well, and again, you kind of just killed my whole next question because it is something like people are actually now trying to figure out hasbara, right? Hasbara,
Right.
that's something that because obviously you share the belief that being a Zionist and being a Jew is just the same thing. It's part and parcel of who we are. So like what do you see as like kind of something a way we can kind of adjust and our approach to maybe like because people aren't willing to hear certain arguments anymore. So
right.
Yeah.
I remember years ago hearing an Israeli general at one of those briefings that you go to in Israel. And he said to us, you Americans are always upset about our hasbara, about our not propaganda, but our PR. He said, but realize this is the problem. Americans want to hear Israel say, we love everyone and embrace everyone. He said, but our enemies on the border need to hear, you mess with us and we will destroy you. And it's really hard to give both of those messages at the same time. And every time we give the message that our neighbors need to hear in order for us to survive, Americans hear that message and say, oh, Israel has such terrible hasbara.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate like the difficulty of being in a really bad neighborhood and speaking to Americans whose neighborhood, remember, is Canada, Mexico, and 2 oceans, right? We are so removed from the thought of a threat on our border. Look at how exercised people get about Mexican immigration, which in another part of the world would be nothing. I mean, it is for us, it's a real political issue, but it would be nothing if you were in the Middle East. I mean, Mexicans coming over the border, that's not the issue. So we have a really hard time, I think, in explaining to people who are not willing to understand what it is to live as a democracy in the Middle East. So we try, but I'm not sure that better PR is going to be the answer. I honestly feel as though in Europe and maybe even in the Middle East, people are starting to awaken to the fact that the enemies of Israel are the enemies of the world. And that's always been true. The enemies of the Jews have always been the enemies of the world. The Soviet communists were the enemies of the world, and the Nazis were the enemies of the world. And that's just, and I think that will be better. That'll be better than any PR we can advance.
Yeah, well said. They always come
Right.
for us first.
Yeah.
I have one thing to David Chaim, maybe you can ask the next question.
Oh, can I actually just ask a follow-up to what Rabbi
Oh,
Wolpe
sure.
just said? So this point about the enemies of the Jews being the enemies of the world, I've read about this theological take on Jewish history, which is that essentially, we believe that those who bless us shall be blessed and those who curse us shall be cursed. Do you believe that there is truth to this claim that like when the Jews start being targeted, that's when, things are going in a bad direction, morally speaking? Like
Yeah, I think yes, I actually do. Even historically, because first of all, anti-Semitism is always a conspiracy theory, which means that people feel like things are going bad and they have to find a scapegoat. I mean, look how much worse anti-Semitism got when things got worse in Germany. It was already there, obviously, but it got worse. And I think that people have felt a real sense for the last, I don't know, 20 years in America of things not going, when I listen to my daughter's generation, they are considerably less optimistic than I was and my generation growing up. We just, honestly, I know it sounds naive and stupid. We just sort of assumed everything was going to be okay in America. We just did. And I don't think people assume that anymore. And so, yes, I think that the hostility towards Jews that you see is in part a sort of generalized things are not going well, and obviously, if things aren't going well, the Jews must have something to do with it, right? So,
Yeah, I think also just a culture usually degenerates or civilization usually degenerates. The first signs you see is like the attacking of Jews, but like I think that kind of what sets the stage to this recently in America is I feel maybe I'm wrong, but trying to take God out of the out of public schools, trying to burning the flag, kneeling for the anthem, all of these like all these symbols of like national pride, kind of like disunified this country. All these symbols.
so I would say right without like why questions always have too many answers. And if we wanted to talk about what went wrong with America, we could have, there's so many things that we could identify as having been problematic. More important to me at the moment, not in general, the moment, than the specific things that went wrong are why does that automatically turn to the Jews are bad? And I think part of the reason that that's so is, and Ruth Wise talks about this brilliantly, is hating Jews creates coalitions. Like when we saw on campus people saying queers for Hamas, and everybody thought how ridiculous that was. I thought of what Ruth Wise used to say, which is, it doesn't matter that they don't agree about anything else. They can agree about hating Jews. And it creates a coalition. And so when things start to fall apart, people want to feel unified, and you can be unified because they're the ones that did it to us. And so, look, I mean, there are a lot of prescriptions about what will put America back together again. As I said, I think these things are always really complicated. They're not simple. And you have to ask yourself, you always have to ask yourself what went before that. Why did people feel that way about the flag? Why did people start to kneel? On and on and on and on. I mean, look, part of the cause that I always attribute to is transparency, and by that I mean loss of faith in leaders had to do in part with the fact that people knew more about their leaders. Kennedy and Clinton did the same thing in the White House. But when Kennedy did it, none of the news would report it. They knew about it, but nobody would put it in the newspaper. Clinton did it, and everybody puts it on the front page. And so you have a whole generation of kids that have learned terrible things about leadership. I mean, just take one example. It's really hard to grow up as a Catholic kid knowing about the scandals in the Catholic Church. I mean, when you think about how many priests did what they did, how do you now have respect for authority? So I think that that's why, again, it really is important for people in religious life to try their best to be decent and to be good and to be kind, because that's how you restore the authority of, I mean, like you spoke about Rabbi Sacks. That one person did so much to restore the sense of faith that people had in like a Jewish religious authority being able to speak to the world. You can do a lot of good, but you can also do a lot of bad.
Yeah, and to your point, it's funny that we see Nick Fuentes, a white supremacist,
Right.
and Kanye West, who's a black supremacist,
Right.
how they kind of join forces using the Jews as kind of
there you go. There's the alliance. Yeah.
there's the alliance. I mean,
Perfect
they both
example.
want segregation. They both want the same thing, but it's interesting.
Perfect example.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. So I actually, David Chai, if you want to take the next question, I have one question after this as well.
Okay.
Sure, yeah. Just to give a little like glimmer of hope. I mean, I'm I'm like younger than I'm the younger one here. So my generation I've noticed is a bit more despondent and hopeless about the future.
Yeah.
But the point that you made earlier about our allies, I was actually, based on my understanding of history, I was shocked at how many non-Jewish allies we have.
Yeah.
I think it's a historical event that we have this many voices speaking up for Judaism and for Israel even, like Douglas Murray, even
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson has this
Yeah.
unbelievable respect for what Israel has accomplished, and but there's a lot to unpack there, and it gives me a little bit of hope. So maybe this time
Yeah.
we can look at it a little bit in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, so onto that final question, a little bit of faith.
Well, there'll be one question after this,
Okay.
actually.
On the
Oh yeah,
penultimate.
sorry.
Okay.
The penultimate, yes. I So in a recent discussion, I actually attended it and met you there. It was a very nice to meet you at the 92 NY
Right.
that shul. You had a discussion about whether Judaism can continue without belief in God.
Right.
So how do we make belief in God more compelling and relevant in a world where skepticism often dominates? Are there specific examples or trends that give you hope in this regard?
Um, so I think um, I think if God is made more as a source of hope and less as a source of punitive condemnation, we have a better chance because we live in a very anti-punitive world. That wasn't always true. People used to think of punishment as an essential part of, but that's not, the therapeutic culture doesn't work that way. And I think if you speak about God as being a source of hope, you will have a much better. In fact, do you know the most common command in the Torah is al tira, don't be afraid. And I think that that's a beautiful message to let people know, which is that the God that we believe in is not there in order to inculcate fear, but to help you with the fear that you have. So if people speak about God, I think both intelligently and hopefully, we can do better than we've done thus far, or at least recently.
So before we go, I just want to ask you one personal question because
Sure,
you
please.
share the stage with so many, famous people and rabbis and Christians and
Yeah.
atheists. So I wanted to know from all of your, maybe you can give us some highlights, but what were some of your favorite moments in all of
Mm.
your public speeches, which are very well known on, for example, YouTube? So, what were some of those moments that you just felt were like so memorable and so special?
Can I tell you one of the most memorable moments that I will never forget this? Um, in some ways, the most memorable moment was in 2016. I got a call from the Democratic National Convention, and they said, we want someone to do the closing benediction to the night that the president, this was President Obama's second term, is nominated, and would you be willing to do a benediction? I said, of course I'll be willing to do it. So I get there. I've never done a benediction at a convention. And of course, it was also like, why are you doing it Democrats and not the Republicans? I said, look at the Republicans and asked me, I would have done it there too. I'll do a benediction at any convention. But, okay, so I'm there. And for a variety of reasons, and I think I have some idea of why, but nonetheless, they put the benediction at the end of the voting for president, which meant that every state said, we give our X number of votes to the president, and then they get up and leave. So at the beginning of the night, there's an auditorium with like several thousand people there, and the benediction is going to be at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and no one's going to be left in the entire place. I mean, like C-SPAN cuts off the cameras already by the time I'm giving my benediction. So I went up to the guy who was running the convention was Antonio Villaraigosa, who was mayor of Los Angeles, and his nephew was there. So I walk over to his nephew, and I say to him, by the time I give the benediction, it's going to be you and me and the maintenance staff. And you know what he said to me?
Okay.
And God.
Oh, wow.
And it hit me between the eyes.
Wow.
And changed my entire, like, I thought, that's right. I'm praying to God. I'm not supposed to be praying so that thousands of people will hear me. I'm supposed to be praying so the Kodesh Baruch Hu hears me. And I'll never forget that moment. And I think about it every time I get caught up in, is there going to be a crowd? Is there not going to be a crowd? I always think if you just remember that, it's like there's a Hasidic story like that about the rabbi who a peasant comes up to him and says, "Tell me, who do you work for?" And the rabbi says, "You know what? I'll give you a salary if every day, once a day, you ask me that question." Just because, like, to remember that you're supposed to be doing it for the Kodesh Baruch Hu and not for your ego and not for the crowd. I'll never forget that moment. So.
Wow, that's
What a great
all the
story.
things that you could have said. I love how you chose that story. That's really amazing.
Yeah,
So
I was expecting your car ride with Christopher Hitchens to come up for sure.
Next time.
we really want to thank you for making the time.
Thank you. It was
We
a
had
pleasure. Thanks
yes,
so much.
it was a pleasure, and hope to stay in touch.
Yep,
Thank
absolutely.
you. God
Thank
bless.
you, Rabbi Wolpe.
Bye-bye.